Hi, you're on the Nomad of Dreams channel. Today I will talk about Confucius's philosophy and explain the key ideas as a practical philosophy of moral formation and social order. We will analyze why ritual, reciprocity, and the model of the noble person work as techniques of character and governance. The topic is important because the philosophy here is not an abstraction for debate, but a set of methods for everyday life and social resilience. Where are you listening from now, and what time is it there? Write it in the comments. I like seeing the geography and listening hours. Take a couple of deep breaths, exhale slowly, relax your shoulders. This small anchor will help you hear the meaning of simple practices more clearly. Confucius as a thinker places morality at the center as a social practice and an individual work on oneself. His thinking focuses on norms, habits, and forms of behavior that shape character and the stability of relationships. These ideas continue to work because their power lies in repetition and in simple techniques. Habit becomes disposition, and disposition determines behavior in difficult situations. At the core is the conviction that a person is improved through practice, through daily effort, through careful work on roles and duties. The main emphasis is humaneness as a practical duty that shapes everyday decisions and relationships. Humaneness is not understood as an abstract feeling, but as a concrete set of actions: attention to another, restraint in words, readiness to fulfill duty in small matters. It is the art of living within the relation to one's neighbor, where every action is tested by whether it respects the dignity of the other. It is in such practice that the stability of public life is revealed. Order grows out of many small, honest acts. Another pillar of this philosophy is ritual as a technology of habit. Ritual organizes the body and attention, forms automatisms that act faster than reason when needed. Music, ceremonies, simple rules of greeting or dining work the same way. They cultivate feelings, help regulate emotional impulses, and channel energy into forms compatible with social tasks. Ritual teaches maintaining order through repetition and makes morality accessible in the details of everyday life. The ideal of the noble person describes inner work as the main criterion of authority and power. The noble person is not a title, but a continuous laboratory of the self. Attention to words, self-control, honesty of intent. When a leader acts according to such a rule, their power becomes rooted in trust, and governance requires less coercion. Reputation based on consistency works stronger than punishment because people follow image and example. Reverence for parents and family duty serve not only as a private feeling, but as the basic cell of public morality. Respect within the family sets a template of roles and responsibilities that then extends into the public sphere. Precision in names and roles returns meaning to social relations. When position, duty, and behavior correspond to their names, predictability of actions increases, and chaos in people's expectations of one another decreases. Righteousness functions as a criterion for the right choice in a concrete situation. It is not a mechanical formula, but the ability to choose an action that matches duty and place. Reciprocity offers a practical limitation on one's will. Before acting, check how this action will be perceived by another. Such a test of moral predictability helps actions become stable for the community. Learning is viewed as a career project of morality. Reading, repetition, and discussion are training for memory, attention, and moral skills. Memory disciplines, discussion clarifies meaning, and repetition makes disposition automatic. Governance through example requires constant work on oneself because external authority is stable only when the inner backbone is not eroded by small concessions. The aesthetics of rites and music functions as a soft tool for cultivating feeling. The beauty of ceremony and musical harmony gently structures emotional life so that moral habits do not feel like dry prescriptions, but part of good living. The middle way offers a method of avoiding extremes, allowing one to maintain a steady practice and make decisions that support long-term stability. Sincerity of intention binds word and deed. When word matches action, trust grows and social ties strengthen. This inner coherence is one of the guarantees that rules and rituals are not empty formality, but a viable technique of human coexistence. In the following fragments, we will examine each of these points in detail, explore the mechanics and limits of their application, and begin with how humaneness is turned into an everyday duty and what practical steps follow from that. Let's start with simple steps. Do a morning ritual of intention. 3 deep breaths, a short pause, and formulate one action you will do for the sake of another. In communication practice, active listening. Don't interrupt, clarify, repeat the essence of the speaker's words in your own terms. Small kind deeds, offering a hand, holding the door, saying thank you, become established faster than grand promises. Keep a record. Short notes in the evening will help you see progress and areas to work on. Train check-in reciprocity. Before acting, imagine how the other will feel. If there is doubt, choose the more respectful option. This is a discipline that turns an idea into habit. In the next part, I will suggest concrete exercises. A daily 5-minute meditational intention, paired active listening practices, simple musical rituals before work, and family agreements on duties. These techniques can be adapted to your rhythm and started from small steps. Start with one habit and return to the practice every day. Also, humaneness is a practical duty, a daily technology of attention to others and to yourself. It manifests not in episodic impulses, but in the habit of evaluating each action through the lens of respect for another's dignity, through the readiness to fulfill one's duty in small and large matters. For you, this means looking at choice not as a philosophical dilemma, but as a series of simple tests. Does this action preserve a human face? Does it strengthen trust and order around you? Explaining this duty requires unpacking its internal components. The constituents of humaneness are observance, restraint, the ability to enter a role and perform what is expected by status and situation. Observance allows you to notice another's need before it becomes a demand. Restraint holds back impulses that could destroy a relationship. Role guides behavior so that it corresponds to one's place in the network of relations. When these elements operate together, they form a practice that easily integrates into everyday life and gradually replaces spontaneity with acceptable automatisms. The mechanism of turning duties into habit is simple in structure and complex to maintain. Repetition cements bodily memory. Greeting gestures, tone of voice, order of actions in the family or at work cease to require conscious effort. The psychology of reinforcement operates at the level of attention and emotion. Regular action generates an expectation of response from others, which reinforces the motivation to continue. Consequences include increased predictability in relationships, reduced conflict, and improved efficiency of joint tasks. The limits of this mechanism appear where repetition becomes automatism without reflection. Then the habit exists for its own sake, detached from meaning, and loses power as a moral guide. What does this look like in a concrete moral situation? It is important to be able to correlate action with role and with relationship. At the moment of choice, you should ask yourself a short inner criterion. Does this action respect the other's position? Does it support order? Does it strengthen trust? This criterion works as a simple test of humaneness. It does not require complex arguments, but does require honesty with oneself and attention to contextual details. This approach preserves the balance between emotion and duty and makes moral decision-making workable in real life. There are boundaries to this practice, and it is useful to recognize them. Humaneness does not provide ready answers to all collisions. Complex public issues require synthesis of many duties and sometimes compromise between conflicting roles. Also, repetitive practice can become ritual without meaning if it loses connection to the experience of responsibility. Limits are visible where rule replaces reasoning and automatism absorbs real compassion. Accepting this boundary is part of the discipline. Care for the form while keeping the link to intention. The connection of this idea with the name Confucius is obvious and important. Confucius saw humaneness as a central virtue, as an orienting principle for all other norms of life. He proposed turning this quality into practice through rites, through everyday duties, and through the example of elders. It was precisely continuous training and repetition of actions that were to produce the humaneness that then spreads into the public sphere. Confucius also emphasized that humaneness is cultivated in family relationships and social roles. Small everyday kindness serves as the basis for major political decisions, because trust and responsibility grow out of habits. This makes a person's moral status stable and testable. Consistency in small things forms reliability in large matters, and society gains predictability in its members' behavior. Maintaining sincerity of intentions is the link between form and content. When word corresponds to action, habits remain meaningful rather than decorative. Confucius summed up the thought that without an inner connection between intention and action, ritual loses its educative power. Therefore, the crucial task is to maintain reflection on habit, to periodically return meaning to actions, rather than leaving them on the surface. For you, this means keeping an ordinary check with each action. Find out which role you are playing now, what duty it imposes, and whether your motives contain sincere respect for the other. Such daily practice turns an abstract virtue into a working tool of life. Humaneness becomes not an ideal on a pedestal, but a visible, measurable, and reproducible way of being that shapes character and social order. Practice of humaneness requires simple rituals of self-control, a pause before answering, checks of consequences, and a small rehearsal of behavior. These rituals are easy to include in a routine. Notice the interlocutor's reaction, name it aloud, and, if necessary, adjust your tone. This does not demand great heroism, but requires discipline. Discipline of the heart and mind. It is important not to confuse discipline with harshness. The goal is openness and order, not suppression. The boundaries of humaneness also require care for one's own resources. You cannot give everything away without replenishing reserves of attention and time. Do not be afraid to set boundaries. This does not diminish your humaneness, but makes it stable and sincere. A commonality of values arises when people share these simple practices and support one another in performing them. Teacher, manager, parent. All roles can be platforms for transmitting stable moral practices. Finally, humaneness is a skill of public honesty. Admitting mistakes, repaying debts, and not building facades of infallibility. Only in this key does humaneness cease to be an abstract virtue and become a working competence valuable for family, business, and politics. When this competence is rooted, you are less dependent on moods and can see wider opportunities for good decisions. In this sense, humaneness is not a luxury, but a professional skill worth training every day. Make it a habit. Rituals and norms in everyday life often look as if their task is completed by themselves. There is a set of movements, words, and procedures, and people repeat them. The problem is not repetition per se. The problem is that repetition can be devoid of purpose and a sense of connection to the inner world. When order becomes pure form and meaning is set aside, actions stop changing character. Ritual becomes an instrument for maintaining the appearance of order rather than a technology for shaping the person. For ritual to serve an educative function, simple criteria must be clarified. They set a standard by which one can judge whether a given norm works as a means of personal development. The criteria are: A. Meaningfulness, that is, knowledge of why the action is done. B. Bodily habit, internal automatization of the gesture while retaining attention. C. Emotional connection, the ability to evoke a feeling of respect or compassion. D. Social recognition, when the procedure is affirmed by the community. E. Flexibility, the ability to change under new conditions without losing meaning. F. Linkage of name and content, precision of roles and titles. These points are not philosophical abstractions, but a working scale for evaluating any practice. Each criterion is manifested differently. Meaningfulness requires that you can say the reason for the action to yourself and feel its significance. Bodily habit arises through repetition and demands reflection at the same time. Movements become easy, but the readiness to change if context shifts is preserved. Emotional connection means the ritual not only regulates outward behavior, but touches feelings, making the experience personal and memorable. Social recognition provides feedback. When the environment responds, the habit is reinforced and becomes an element of collective culture. Flexibility protects the ritual from turning into dogma. Precision of names and roles returns the action to responsibility. When the name of the role is clear, duties no longer dissolve into uncertainty. Confucius believed that it is through such dense linkage of form and meaning that rituals become an educational technology. The consequences of rituals that meet these criteria are noticeable and deep. At the personal level, a stable moral regulator is formed. Reactions are tied not to momentary desire, but to a rehearsed standard. Emotions become manageable because there are structural supports for their expression. At the social level, predictability of interactions increases. People know which expectations operate widely, and this reduces conflict. Ritual forms collective memory. Shared practices are transmitted with less loss of meaning than isolated instructions. This accelerates learning and makes behavior transparent for evaluation. Confucius linked rites with the cultivation of feeling and maintained the idea that music and ritual develop an aesthetic relation to the world that then disciplines willpower and attention. There is also a flip side of consequences worth considering. If the criteria are ignored, ritual can generate hypocrisy, where external observance masks inner emptiness. Procedures without emotional and intellectual support become a heavy burden for those who perform them. Pressure to maintain form in the absence of community recognition leads to alienation. Large institutions that rely only on formal rules acquire structural rigidity and lose the ability to adapt. Confucius warned that ritual must keep its connection to sincere intentions. Otherwise, its strength runs out. A paragraph that helps understand how this works in practice is short and concrete. A daily act of greeting between elder and younger, performed with conscious respect and repeated within the family, strengthens the habit of attentive regard and becomes a model for interaction in other spheres. The boundary of ritual effectiveness is clear and requires acknowledgement. Ritual does not replace just institutions and does not solve systemic injustices by its mere existence.
It can soften tension and cultivate character, but it does not remove structural causes of suffering or abuses of power. Rituals work where there remains the possibility of free consent and mutual recognition of roles. When action is coercive, meaning is lost, and procedures become an instrument of compulsion rather than education. Moreover, ritual is limited by cultural context and requires transmission. Without an environment that supports meaningfulness and feedback, it disappears or turns into an empty gesture. Therefore, caring for rituals includes not only repetition but teaching, discussion of reasons, and periodic revision. Confucius emphasized the role of the teacher and the elder in preserving the living meaning of rites. Elders should show example and explain the reason, rather than leave the form on autopilot. The last boundary is related to personal sincerity. Ritual can shape character only if it is coupled with inner work on motivation. If actions are repeated purely for external evaluation, no habit will convert behavior into virtue. Understanding this limitation helps avoid hypertrophy of form and directs effort to maintaining the link between word and deed. Confucius repeated the thought that external order and inner sincerity must be connected. Only then does ritual function as a technology of human formation. In practical terms, this means simple things.
Make sure each action has an explanation. Let the body remember the form while the mind stays attentive. Ensure the community gives feedback and allow procedures to adapt. Then ritual will cease to be a relic and begin to live as a tool that forms taste, will, and responsibility. Such an approach returns purpose to norms that Confucius considered key to educating the person and order in society. The ideal of the noble person is arranged as a set of interconnected practices that translate moral intentions into habits and decisions. First comes inner awareness, attention to one's motives, and readiness to correct them. Then regular actions follow, rituals of speech and conduct, the manner of responding to insult or honor, the way of carrying a conversation and reasoning. These repeated practices fix neural and mental patterns, turning moral choice into an accessible reflex. Confucius saw in this a mechanism that does not rely only on abstract principles, but constructs character through regular exercise in worthy behavior. The inner framework of this technology is composed of three elements. First, a model to imitate. One who lives by the norm becomes a living metric. Second, discipline of self-observation. Daily checking of speech and actions. Reflection on what has been done. Third, socialization of practices. Habits are embedded in family and social ties, where others confirm and correct them. Together, these elements function as feedback. Action forms habit. Habit strengthens character. Character makes higher expectations of oneself and others possible. The mechanism does not work as an instant transformation, but as a training process. At first, a person learns small things, answering respectfully and on time, keeping one's word, accepting criticism without humiliation. These frequent and low-energy exercises accumulate and then allow one to endure more serious trials. Confucius emphasized that nobility does not come automatically with position or education. It grows from repeatedly practicing virtue. Therefore, consistent practice, not declaration of ideals, is important. Why this mechanism is needed in society and in the life of a specific person becomes clearer when looking at the functions it performs. At the personal level, it provides support in moral choice. When internal standards are rehearsed, decisions are made faster and with less emotional tremor. Such a person is less susceptible to passing passions and fashionable extremes. At the public level, the model of the noble person functions as a stabilizer of expectations. Clear norms of interaction form around it, reducing levels of distrust and uncertainty. People enter agreements more easily when they know that some participants are committed to certain behavioral standards. Moreover, the mechanism serves as a source of moral influence without coercion. The behavior of the noble person creates a moral authority that works more effectively than formal sanctions. This type of power rests on respect and imitation, not intimidation. In the long run, a society where examples of moral accomplishment are visible and accessible develops more easily. Institutions need fewer coercive measures because civic reciprocity and responsibility are reinforced by habits. Where the mechanism breaks down, it is immediately apparent. Breakage occurs when the model turns into a title or a pseudo-role stripped of inner discipline. If people learn to perform the outward signs of nobility without systematic scrutiny of motives, behavior remains theatrical. Another narrow point of failure is when the community stops affirming practices. Virtuous acts go unnoticed and receive no feedback. Under such conditions, habits thin out and the model loses its magnetic pull. Breakdowns also occur at the level of institutions. If those appointed to office know only how to display an image rather than bear responsibility to the collective, the norm becomes an empty form. If the selection system conceals personal qualities behind documents and connections, the self-restoring mechanism becomes ineffective. Confucius warned that external signs of authority without inner righteousness lead to crisis of trust. Authority stripped of moral grounding quickly loses influence and breeds cynicism. Another vulnerability is the accessibility of the ideal. When nobility is described in a way that is attainable by only a few, it ceases to be a tool for educating broad layers of society. Social inaccessibility creates alienation and devaluation of the norm. The ideal must be visible and understandable as a process that anyone can begin. Otherwise, it becomes a stepchild of culture, serving as an excuse for elitism. The psychological side of this problem is also important. Those who sincerely strive for inner improvement can face burnout if their efforts receive no recognition or are met with hostility. Then the example turns into selfless loneliness, and society loses an important resource. Supporting the practice through feedback and shared responsibility reduces the risk of expelling exemplars from public life. The conclusion follows from the structure and vulnerabilities. The ideal of the noble person is a working technology of character that requires constant care and protection. Maintaining it needs a system, clear behavioral exemplars, regular self-checking, and social infrastructure that affirms and rewards sincere practice. Confucius suggests that the exemplar must be both strict and accessible. Its strength lies in making moral achievement attainable through habit and example. If you want to approach this principle, start small. Tie your daily actions to understandable standards, check your motives, take responsibility for your role toward others, and seek feedback. Do this consistently, not episodically. Then the practice will stop being a personal idea and become a living mechanism of character formation that works in the family, the group, and society. Confucius emphasized that nobility requires labor. This labor is simple and repeatable, and it is in repetition that it reveals its power. Why did Confucius demand precision in names and call it the key to order in family and state? The question is so simple, it answers itself. Words set expectations, and expectations govern behavior. When name, role, and duty coincide, people find it easier to understand what they are responsible for and what they may demand of one another. Confucius insisted that the language of public life cannot be free of responsibility. Every word carries an accountability and a promise. The rectification of names is not a philosophical slogan, but a technical device for anchoring behavior to clear rules. The title of an office speaks of a set of duties. The name of a kinship tie fixes not only sensitivities, but concrete actions. Care, respect, accompanying duties. When you call someone a leader, you signal the expectation of service before them. When you call someone a student, you signal the right to teach and to be taught. Confucius saw in these relations a way of turning abstract virtues into concrete acts. The mechanism is simple and healthy. First, a word is established and its content described. Then the community consolidates that meaning through repetitive practices, public confirmations, and sanctions for nonconformity. Within consciousness, the role begins to function as instruction. The name evokes a set of habits and moral obligations. This achieves predictability in relationships. People know which expectations are safe to voice, and what consequences will follow their violation. When names perform their function, uncertainty decreases. Decisions are made faster because there is no need to clarify the boundaries of responsibility each time anew. Confucius associated such clarity with trust. Trust is built on the transparency of duties and on people's ability to answer for their words. From this grow stable agreements that do not depend on personal liking or private connections. There is an economy of trust governed by names. In it, investments in public projects and personal commitments become less risky because the risk of uncertainty is reduced. Governance through names yields bonuses. It lessens the need for harsh punishments, simplifies cooperation, and increases the accountability of those who hold titles. Confucius believed that power anchored by precision in names retains order more easily without brute force. Understanding the mechanism requires a look at practical details. The name of a duty must be described concretely. It is not enough to formally call someone a guardian if their role remains undefined. Expectations, types of actions, and boundaries of responsibility require clear agreement. The social mechanism works when words are backed by deeds and when the community is ready to mark deviations. Empty labels create an illusion of order. When a name exists as a label without content, it deceives those who hope for stability. Such names blunt responsibility and breed cynicism. Confucius noted that titles must be filled with moral content. Otherwise, words lose their force and the managerial system collapses. The practical part of rectifying names requires 3 steps. First, bring the role to a clear formulation. List duties and performance criteria. Then, it is important to embed these formulations in public practice through regular reports, rituals of recognition, and verification mechanisms. Finally, be prepared to correct names when circumstances change, so that the word again reflects a real function. This way, words remain alive and responsive to life. Personal responsibility also has a place in this technique. You can check your relationships and roles right now. Look at what names you use for your duties at home and at work. Are they accompanied by concrete actions, or do they serve as a screen for inaction? Tie each of your words to a minimum of concrete actions, to a set of habits that can be seen and measured. Then you will begin to translate names into real duties and see your own role more clearly. The social dimension of rectifying names requires collective discipline. A group that is accustomed to clarifying duties and discussing deviations forms a culture of responsibility. Where the habit of giving precise names is absent, ambiguity grows and efforts of goodwill quickly dissipate. Confucius stressed that rectifying names operates as a public technology. Its effectiveness depends on the readiness of many people to uphold the agreement. The limitation of this practice is visible in the subtleties of language and in the possible rigidity of formulations. Excessive literalism of names can harden into ritual and hinder flexibility in complex life situations. Therefore, it is important to maintain a balance between precision and reasonable adaptation. A name should guide behavior, but not destroy the capacity for compassion and consideration of context. The conclusion should be fixed simply. The rectification of names is a tool for creating responsibility and trust. A name must be a link between word and action, between role and duty. Confucius proposed treating language as a task, not as a pretty habit. If you begin to name things more precisely and anchor those names in deed, many everyday difficulties will lose their sharpness and become manageable. This work requires repetition and returning to the meaning of words, but it is in that constancy that its power is revealed. Confucius left us a practical task: clothe language in responsibility and allow society to rely on the clarity of names. If the concept of righteousness operates in a society as a working norm, people begin to make decisions based on the common criterion of justice and duty. This provides a stable line of behavior. Public and private choices become predictable, agreements last longer, and trust between people accumulates. The consequences are visible in the reduced need for coercive measures, fewer corruption loopholes, and in the fact that moral conflicts are more often resolved through discussion of duties rather than by force. One who acts by this criterion receives not only approval but also a clear inner support when making difficult decisions. The reason for such consequences lies in how righteousness shapes inner motivation. Righteousness emphasizes not external formality, but the appropriateness of an act in relation to relationships and roles. When a person asks themselves whether an action corresponds to duty, they do not use an abstract set of prohibitions, but a practical, orienting point tied to duties and responsibility. This orienting point produces habits that become automatic behavior. Before choosing, a person checks whether the action meets the criteria of justice and duty. As a result, decisions are made faster and with less moral hesitation because a ready scale of judgment exists. Clarification is important to avoid blurring the concept. Righteousness is not a label, not a loud word for public speeches. It is the ability to evaluate an action from the perspective of long-term duties and proportionality between demand and ability to fulfill it. The inner signs of righteousness can be listed: sincere intention to perform a role, awareness of consequences for others, and the ability to give up personal gain for the sake of a public norm. The evaluative scale includes motivation, manner of execution, and results for social ties. If one link is weak, the degree of righteousness falls. Understanding how to apply this criterion in practice is aided by breaking it into elements. Each act can be considered through 3 questions. The first concerns role. What duty rests on you in this situation? The second focuses on intention. Are you moved by duty or by ephemeral interest? The third evaluates consequences. Will the action strengthen public trust or weaken it? This 3-part check serves as a simplified method that translates an abstract value into a concrete decision. If, in answering these questions, a sense of proportionality and responsibility remains, the act can be considered righteous. It is important to note the limits of the criterion. The same norm of righteousness requires attention to context and mature judgment. Without attentiveness to circumstances, applying the criterion can turn into dogmatism, where formal conformity to role obscures human understanding. Then, evaluation becomes dry and can cause harm if it does not consider consequences for the vulnerable or unexpected constraints. Therefore, righteousness implies not only following duty, but also the ability to relate duty to mercy and wisdom in a specific situation. The practical side means constant checking of one's own motivation and habits. You can develop a set of simple techniques for this. Record the decision and motive before acting. Track consequences over a short interval. Discuss difficult choices with those whose opinion you value. Such discipline turns the criterion into an ability, not a random impulse. Cultivating the skill of righteousness is like training attention. At first, you must deliberately hold the standard, then it becomes part of the moral reflex. The connection of this idea with the philosopher's name is visible in how he linked personal improvement with the governance of the state. Confucius placed righteousness among the norms that form the framework of social life. For him, righteousness was the thread that connects individual acts with social stability. Confucius proposed developing the capacity to judge the appropriateness of action, not as an intellectual game, but as a daily practice on which respect within the family and trust in governance depend. Confucius left a practical demand: learn to recognize duty and sharpen the skill of acting in accordance with it. This demand is not utopian. It is working and measurable by consequences for relationships, by clarity of roles, and by readiness to take responsibility. If you test your decisions by the criterion of righteousness, you will see how your surroundings change. People will begin to count on your actions, and this returns to you the ability to influence without coercion. Righteousness thus becomes a tool of moral effectiveness and the basis of long-term social reliability that Confucius offered as a practical solution for personal and public life. The practice of righteousness encounters difficulties, ambiguous duties, conflicting roles, environmental pressure. In such cases, it is useful to develop several rules. Formulate obligations precisely. Discuss priorities with stakeholders. Fix timeframes and criteria for success. Leadership based on righteousness requires readiness to admit mistakes and correct course. Otherwise, trust quickly depletes. In upbringing, it is important to combine example and explanation. Children learn not from abstract slogans, but by seeing how adults make difficult choices while preserving conscience and responsibility. At the public level, institutions should support the norm of righteousness through transparent procedures, possibilities for appealing decisions, and encouragement of those who act honestly. This prevents turning the criterion into dogma and preserves flexibility in changing circumstances. The practice of righteousness is not a one-off virtue, but a long-term project. It requires self-observation, dialogue, and readiness to change approaches in response to reality. Only then will it truly become a living principle, strengthening ties between people and giving them support in a complex world. This is a path where small acts and durable habits, repeated, create the fabric of a society in which duty and humanity go hand in hand. A particular case arises when duties are layered upon one another, while a clear priority is absent. In family life, this can manifest as the demand for care, coupled with managing shared property. In administrative practice, as the coincidence of the roles of advisor and executor. In such situations, the criterion of righteousness serves not as a template, but as a procedure of ordering. It helps to single out which duty has primary importance at a given moment, and which measures are proportionate to responsibility. This is not a story of morality in abstraction, but an analysis of the mechanism for resolving role conflicts within a real network of duties. The generalization shows that this mechanism extends to any system of social ties. If every action is checked through the prism of role, motivation, and consequences, then people's behavior organizes itself. Repeated checks become habit, a ritual of deliberation. The naming of a role and its precise definition return responsibility to its place. The expectation of corresponding behavior is formed as a public standard. Confucius regarded such work with names and duties as a technology of morality, a way of creating predictable relationships through the simple practice of being mindful about what you are supposed to do. A brief conclusion. When duties are structured and embedded in practices, the right to decide shifts from arbitrary will to a norm that withstands the test of repetition. This reduces chaos in interactions and makes trust possible without constant oversight. The question is asked why this method works. The reason is that people orient themselves not only to rules, but to how others understand their role. The mechanism structure includes 3 elements. The first element is clarity of the role's name and duties, which sets a scale of expected actions. The second element is the performer's motivation, that is, the internal assent to accept the role as duty. The third element is checking consequences, when the proportionality of actions and their impact on relational ties becomes the criterion of success. Consequences manifest in stability of exchanges, reduction of conflicts, and strengthening of reputation. Confucius highlighted precisely this set of actions as a practical technology. Words must match deeds, and deeds, roles that people understand and accept. Analysis shows that institutions benefit from implementing such a practice. Clear procedures for forming duties, rules of accountability, and public ways of designating responsibility enhance the effect of the criterion of righteousness. If an organization enshrines a standard in which a role is discussed and recorded, personal conflicts are reduced to procedural resolution. This saves the resources of trust. People invest energy in fulfilling obligations instead of constantly checking colleagues' motives. For broad practice, this means that rituals and rules are not vestiges, but working tools of moral capital. I will suggest several simple techniques that help to embed this principle into everyday practice. First, formulate duties in writing or aloud so they cease to be ethereal expectations. Second, note motives before key decisions. Ask yourself whether duty or immediate gain moves your action. Third, record observable consequences in the near term to see whether trust is being strengthened. These actions are like training. At first, they require effortful attention. Then, they form stable reflexes. You can do this in personal relationships and at work, turning the criterion into an instrument rather than a slogan. A small analytical stroke clarifies the connection between personal practice and public effect. The reason for public order lies in individuals' habitual reactions to the demands of roles. The structure is in the system of clear names, methods of reproducing norms, and feedback mechanisms. The consequences are interactional resilience, reduced need for coercion, and increased trust. The boundary of this process is determined by the quality of execution. If a role is recorded formally but not backed by sincere acceptance and verification of results, the effect remains weak. Confucius insisted that external forms must grow into internal commitment. Otherwise, order quickly diminishes. Returning to you, it is important to make the practical exercise regular. Start small. Before every important decision, ask yourself the 3 questions. What is your role? What are your motives? And what are the nearest consequences? Write brief answers so they become a support. Over time, you will notice that such checks reduce hesitation and make it easier to explain your actions to others. This is not a theory for exceptional cases. It is a way to live with fewer conflicts and greater clarity of duties. The limitation of the method now clearly comes to light. In conditions of extreme scarcity of resources, or when there is a power that can change the rules unilaterally, the very criterion of righteousness loses some of its effectiveness. Then the rule itself may cease to be a guarantee of accountability if its content is systematically distorted from outside. In such circumstances, additional wisdom is required to connect the criterion with care for the weak, with readiness to adjust the rules, and with institutions that make possible the verification of decisions. Confucius always emphasized that order through names and rituals works in an environment where people are able to hear and respond to one another. Where that is impossible, the criterion remains useful, but requires external support and adaptation. To bring the thought together, I note that the practice of righteousness under intersecting duties turns morality into a technique of distinguishing roles, motivations, and consequences. It develops through habits and institutions, and produces results only with a sincere acceptance of responsibility. If you start with simple checks and maintain them consistently, you will see how rules gain the power to live in deeds, not just in words. Confucius spoke of order beginning with small deeds, and it is precisely in such small things that a person's ability to hold to duty and trust is revealed. Teaching is a rule of life, and discipline and a technique of character, as tangible as training the body. Confucius saw learning as a series of repetitions, explanations, and corrections that are woven into the day and into speech. A word spoken aloud every time, a gesture repeated by ritual, a discussion in a circle. All these are building materials for attention and for moral memory. To learn means to train not only the mind, but also habits of response, willpower, and the ability to hear others. The orientation of this practice is simple: not to accept knowledge as a one-off acquisition, but to turn it into a manageable habit. Regular repetition and discussion carve neural pathways, habits, and reflexes, and comparing them with behavior makes knowledge useful in life. In such a practice, reading is linked with discussion, and discussion serves as a test of sincerity and applicability. Confucius recommended learning in company because collective testing helps reveal weak spots and strengthen virtues. If every day you devote a little attention to one short text, it ceases to remain an abstraction and becomes a guide to action. In the evening, speak aloud several sentences about duty. In the morning, ask yourself where you applied those lines. And within a week, you will find that your speech has changed, and with it, your manner of acting. Tension arises when study turns into a routine of mechanical reproduction without meaning. A profusion of words and information breeds formal competence, in which people know quotations but do not know how to act according to conscience. The absence of feedback renders repetitions empty, and the absence of the body in learning leaves knowledge at the level of representation. Modern life brings another strain. Fragmented attention and the habit of scrolling materials quickly undermine the ability for deep repetition and thoughtful discussion. Another strain is social. Schools and organizations sometimes encourage the display of knowledge as a way of advancement, and then learning serves external appraisal rather than internal restructuring. When emphasis is placed on diplomas and performances, the duty to oneself, which requires honest correction and the recognition of mistakes, disappears. Pedagogical sincerity and exemplary conduct prove key to preserving the meaning of the practice. Analytically, one can distinguish cause, structure, and consequence. The cause of loss of effectiveness is the gap between word and deed and the absence of systemic practice. The structure of a working process includes regular repetition, discussion with the respondent, and application in concrete affairs. The consequence of such a structure is the gradual restructuring of attention, stable behavior, and the habit of testing oneself for conformity with what was heard. The boundary of this effect is tied to the sincerity of participants and the presence of living feedback. The resolution of the problem lies in concrete techniques that make learning embodied and social. Read short passages aloud and keep them in view as long as is needed. Explain what you have heard to another person and ask them to correct inaccuracies. Write brief notes about how the text you read influenced your behavior during the day. Perform small rituals before study, a minute of pause, even breathing, a brief formulation of intent. These actions transfer knowledge from memory into a habit of response. Add sequence and measure. Choose one text and work with it for a week, then move on to the next. Break the material into fragments to be repeated at different times of day. Create a group of 2 or 3 people for weekly discussion, where each meeting records one concrete change in behavior. If you share what you have assimilated in a short oral act before others, this strengthens accountability and makes learning socially meaningful. External publication of results, even small, serves as a way to test sincerity. Include elements of aesthetics and ritual in the practice. The musical meter of speech, smooth hand movements while reading, a moment of silence after a phrase. All these help to bind the word to feeling and bodily organization. Confucius believed that the order of outward forms and beauty of execution nourish inner attention, so the aesthetics of study serve as a bridge between morality and habit. It is important to keep the limitation of the method in mind. Quantitative indicators and formal reports will not replace personal commitment. The number of pages read does not reflect a change of character. The true criterion is the ability to make a different choice in a concrete situation. If the practice is assigned from outside in the spirit of coercion, its effect will quickly become superficial and externally demonstrative. For a lasting result, a combination of personal interest, social responsibility, and constant verification of the application of knowledge is required. So the rule is simple. Learning is repetition, discussion, and application. Tension manifests as the risk of mechanicalness, distraction, and external motivation. Resolution is available through concrete techniques: reading aloud, explaining to others, recording observations, rituals of attention, and collective verification. Try to start small and keep the focus on changes in actions.
Confucius taught that when knowledge becomes habit, it becomes a moral force. If you invest a little patience in this technique, it will begin to restore order in your decisions and in the relationships around you. One kind of power rests on orders, punishments, and visible force. Another power is outlined by example, a manner of being, and the everyday discipline of a leader. Confucius placed the second model at the forefront. For him, governance was, above all, a moral technology in which the leader, by their way of life, shapes a space of trust and voluntary following. A detailed explanation of this approach concerns how example operates in society. Example does not replace laws. It creates an environment in which laws gain meaning. When a leader speaks measuredly, guards words, and performs deeds that correspond to his speech,
People around begin to imitate that rhythm. Rituals, order in speech, and the manner of listening together work as a school of feeling. They cultivate attention to the common, instill the habit of responding to obligations not out of fear, but out of inner demand. Confucius emphasizes that the moral strength of a leader is not a talisman, but skills. The ability to keep one's word, to know one's place, and to admit mistakes. The mechanism is simple to describe, but subtle in execution. First comes personal work, self-control, morning and evening habits, and honest dialogue with one's own mistakes. Then these habits manifest in public actions, politeness in addressing people, attentive listening, fair distribution of duties. Tone of voice, order in documents, respect for formalities become signals that people read faster than any instructions. Music and ritual, of which Confucius spoke, perform the same function. They make moral attention visible and tangible, turning abstract demands into the body of social behavior. The analytical picture in brief. The reason for the effectiveness of such governance is the ability of the behavioral model to penetrate people's private practices. The structure of the process consists of three elements: personal correction and example, repeatable external forms, and collective verification through customs and rituals. Consequences: increased trust, reduced internal conflict, and a more predictable social life. The limits of this method are important. Where culture is destroyed, where institutions are weakened, or where threats require immediate response, mere morality is not enough. Confucius proceeded from the understanding that order begins with the individual, then spreads to the family, and onward into governance. Details of a leader's behavior have practical significance. Small gestures form large expectations. Greeting, observing a cue, acknowledging another's work. These are signals that strengthen norms. Public correction of a mistake in the form of explanation and calm admission reduces the tendency to secrecy and intrigue. Choice of words is important. The correct naming of roles and duties restores boundaries of responsibility and reduces confusion. In systems where positions and duties are clearly defined and reinforced by example, deviations are corrected more quickly and gently. The social level also requires attention. Governance through virtue works as a chain of imitation and reciprocity. When a person at the top demonstrates consistency, those below grow accustomed to expecting honesty and fairness. This is not instant magic. It is a gradual process in which rituals and customs serve as a framework. People learn to trust, not because they are told to, but because their everyday experience confirms the stability of leadership behavior. Confucius called such a sequence a natural school of morality. Example teaches better than instruction. However, the limits of this strategy should be stated. Rapid restoration of order after severe shocks often requires institutional support, and sometimes coercive measures to establish basic security. Where the leader is himself corrupt or demonstrates moral inconsistency, attempts to educate the people through example are doomed. There are also situations where collective moral memory is destroyed, and targeted work is required to create new customs and rituals combined with legal guarantees. Confucius did not deny the role of norms and punishments. He simply put moral example at the center as the primary technology of resilience. Practical fixation is needed by everyone who wants to influence through example. If you occupy a position of responsibility, start with regular actions that are visible to people and intelligible in their meaning. Keep your promises small and verifiable. Appoint people to tasks, not for political calculation, and correct their behavior through instruction, not public humiliation. Meet criticism calmly and respond to it with deed. Introduce simple rituals that fix norms. A short minute of silence before a meeting. A methodological practice of expressing gratitude at the end of the workday. Neatness in record keeping. These techniques turn the pleasant idea of being good into everyday discipline. If you are not in a formal leadership role, you can still use the same technology on a small scale. Start with behavior in your group, family, or team. Your way of life, punctuality in promises, and willingness to correct mistakes will create a local climate. Confucius repeated the idea that change begins with a small circle of responsibility and spreads in waves if supported by customs and attention. The fixation is simple. Power through virtue is a technology of influence based on personal discipline, visible habits, and collective verification through forms and rituals. If you want people to follow you voluntarily, start with yourself. Make your days manageable by habits. Speak little, do much, and be ready to correct what does not match your words. Confucius believed in the power of such a path. Example governs where words lose force and creates an order that withstands time. Music and rituals serve as practical tools for educating the feelings. They shape emotions and attention, anchor habits of behavior, and turn moral prescriptions into bodily responses. This is not merely ornamentation of life. It is a way to teach a person to feel what is right and make it part of everyday reaction. The mechanism of work is simple in the general idea and complex in the details. A repeated sequence of movements, words, or melodies sets the form of attention and orders time. The body, getting used to a certain rhythm, ceases to react to random stimuli and begins to respond to the signals the rite carries. The sound of a musical phrase affects breathing, slows or accelerates the pulse, thereby changing emotional tone. Speech formulas and a repertoire of gestures create a map of expected behavior. It acts as an invisible instruction. In this position, hold your head so. At this moment, listen more deeply. To this person, show respect. These procedures form automatisms that then engage independently of external supervision. Sequence is important. Regularity of repetition maintains the link between intention and bodily habit. And in the long term, morality ceases to be an abstraction and becomes a condition of experience. How does music intervene in a person's sensitivity? It acts on levels that ordinary logic does not touch. Melody sets the relative tonality of relationships. Harmony shows what agreement differs from strain. Rhythm suggests the measure of participation. When sound and movement are in accord, a person's attention stops being held by the self and begins to synchronize with others. This is a restructuring of internal time. The space of impulsive reaction shrinks, a pause between desire and action appears. And in that pause, the capacity to choose develops. The aesthetic side of ritual is not decoration, but a trainer for emotional discharge and rethinking motivations. Musical ritual practices form a taste for order, for coherence between word and gesture, and thanks to this taste, begins to act as a filter in everyday decisions. The image of ritual as a sequence of actions helps see the connection between small and large. Every movement, every spoken word, tidy order in dress and space. These are small rehearsals of character. With many repetitions, a rehearsal becomes a habit. Habit becomes character, and character becomes a social forecast. When many people share similar forms, a social field of feeling arises among them, in which trust grows through predictability. Ritual creates a shared rhythm of action and expectation, links personal behavior with collective memory, and makes morality visible, not as a declaration, but as regular performance. This visibility is important because it turns individual intentions into testable practices that people can read and orient themselves by in difficult situations. The limits of the work of music and ritual must be clearly stated. Where forms have lost connection with genuine care for people and become mere outward spectacle, they lose their educative power and begin to reinforce only outward order. In the absence of sincerity, ritual easily becomes a mask that covers opposite behavior. Moreover, ritual technique does not remove the material causes of suffering and injustice. It changes the heart and attention, but does not automatically solve structural problems that require institutional measures. There is also the risk of mechanical repetition, when practices are preserved for their own sake without understanding the meaning, and then the effect turns into formality. The most important condition of effectiveness remains the linkage of form with sincere intent and with practical work on the conditions of life in which these forms are applied. The connection of these observations with the tradition of Confucius is obvious and practical. Confucius linked ritual and music with the education of feeling and asserted that proper forms lead to harmony in the soul. Confucius believed that rite and melody affect character, and through them, a person acquires the ability to live in harmony with others. Confucius proposed to consider ritual as a technology of character. Regularity and beauty of execution work together to produce a propensity for order and respect. If you treat ritual and music as means of fine-tuning your sensitivity, you will obtain an instrument not for showy piety, but for stable inner ordering. This thought is both simple and deep. Forms teach feeling, and feeling governs action. The practical consequence of this idea is the demand for attentiveness to form, not as ritual splendor, but as a tool of education. In modern institutions, this means care for the quality of everyday practices. How the teacher's speech sounds, how the opening and closing of meetings are organized, how transitions in collective work are marked. When forms are thought out and filled with meaning, they help create conditions for responsibility and mutual respect. When forms leave indifference or pretense, they only mask emptiness. One should also remember flexibility. Ritual, to remain alive, must have the ability to be interpreted and adapted. Otherwise, it dies into ossification. Finally, one must account for the ethical side. To educate through music and rite means to accept responsibility for influencing people's souls and habits. This requires transparency of goals, willingness to critically review practices, and care for those who, by position or circumstance, cannot easily conform to the norms set. Strong forms can support dignity, but can also exacerbate exclusions. Therefore, work with form must go in parallel with work on material conditions and institutions, so that the education of feeling does not become an instrument of control, but serves the development of personal freedom and common good. Thus, music and ritual are not archaisms, but a technology of moral education, if approached consciously. They form not ready answers, but the capacity for attention, for the pause between impulse and action. They give a person time to hear another and feel their own responsibility. And in that pause, a moral choice is born. This is work. Often the problem with the doctrine of the mean appears simple. People get lost between extremes and do not find the proper measure in their actions. Emotions overflow behavior, or, conversely, are suppressed into indifference. Decisions are made in a rush or in endless uncertainty. Such polarity disrupts the stability of relations and makes behavior unpredictable, because those around cannot rely on the consistency of response. With prolonged absence of measure, trust becomes exhausted and collective processes become fragile. People either constantly conflict or retreat into a formal shell where meaning is lost. This fragility manifests in personal life, in governance, and in the culture of work. The consequence is the same: a loss of the ability to adapt smoothly to new circumstances, which requires a delicate proportioning of feelings, rules, and circumstances. The criterion for measuring the mean is not an abstract point, but a set of practical indicators by which action can be evaluated. The first indicator is appropriateness, that is, the correspondence of an act to a specific situation. The second is proportionality of resources invested to the expected result. The third is constancy, the ability to maintain a chosen line in routine, not only in dramatic moments. The fourth is the linkage of word and deed, when intention is confirmed by behavior. For evaluation, an internal indicator is also needed, a feeling that the action does not arise from impulse, but from a conscious pause between desire and act. In this pause, the criterion of the mean is born. Confucius spoke of measure as a habit of the heart and of attentive scrutiny of motives. And it is attention that serves as a practical instrument of assessment. A small example of helping a neighbor: show care that takes into account their real needs, not according to the pattern of your own melodrama or a checklist of duties. The consequences of following this criterion are extensive and can be calculated by a simple analytical scheme. The reason is regular training of attention to a sense of proportion, constant checking of motives, and adjustment of behavior. The mechanism: through repeatable practices, self-analysis, and ritual elements, establishes the habit of choosing the middle measure. These practices include formal rules, role expectations, and personal discipline. Consequences: resilience of the individual and the group, reduced conflicts, increased trust and predictability of behavior. People who live by moderation fall into extreme decisions less often. They create a field where planning and spontaneity combine, and responsibility becomes tangible. Confucius linked such order to a noble character, and believed that the middle line is not weakness, but mature strength, under which actions withstand the test of time and circumstances. It is important to mark the boundaries of applicability of this approach. The middle measure requires situational intelligence and the courage to abandon extreme patterns. Without this, it will turn into mechanical repetition of middle rituals that change nothing. There are circumstances where urgent action and firmness require departing from habitual moderation, and here the middle position by itself does not provide a recipe. Insight is needed. Moreover, the middle way does not eliminate the need to change institutions and conditions that generate extremes. Personal moderation is useful, but does not replace systemic reforms. Another boundary is cultural context. Ideas of measure vary between communities, and what seems moderate in one circle will look disproportionate in another. Finally, there is a risk of complacency, when confidence in the right middle prevents critically assessing the consequences of actions for the weak and vulnerable. Confucius called attention to responsibility for results and to the fact that the middle line requires constant checking of its conformity with justice. This path requires practice and honesty with oneself. The means: regular pauses for revising motive, habits that fix the measure, and readiness to adjust the form of action based on feedback. When you apply this approach, everyday decisions become a gym for character. The habit of holding the mean strengthens the capacity for far-sighted action. Confucius suggested viewing the mean not as a formula, but as a discipline of mind and heart that allows one to live in harmony with others and maintain inner steadiness. If you begin to structure your routine around simple practices of checking intentions and proportionality of actions, you will see how the predictability of relationships changes and how tension in the group decreases. The limitations of this discipline should be considered constantly. The middle measure is valuable when it excludes impulses and supports responsibility. But it does not replace clear rules where they are necessary, and it does not remove the social duty to intervene decisively for the sake of justice. Balance lives on the edge between constant work on oneself and the demand to change the surrounding reality so that it allows this measure to act honestly and effectively. Confucius taught that the middle is not a point of rest, but a process requiring attention and readiness to act when circumstances demand it. The practical instruction is simple. Set clear criteria of appropriateness. Discuss them with the people involved. Record small experiments and analyze the results. Start with 3 questions before acting. What do I want to achieve? What resources am I willing to invest? And how does this relate to the interests of others? Keep feedback logs and clearly distinguish adjustment of character from adjustment of the system. In groups, introduce rituals of pause, a short practice of silence or gathering opinions before a key decision. Personally, a daily 5-minute check of motives. Exercises train not an abstract virtue, but the ability to adapt. By sharpening the measure in small matters, you become ready for larger ones. Remember that the mean is mobile, not static. It changes with circumstances and requires the courage to revise one's own beliefs. Ultimately, measure is a way of respecting yourself and others, an instrument that makes life less destructive and more fruitful with honesty. The mechanism of sincerity is structured as an internal linkage of 3 streams: thought, word, and action. Thought forms intention. Word fixes a promise. Action turns intention into fact. When these streams are aligned, trust and simplicity of communication arise. Within this mechanism operate attention to motivation, the ability to hold a pause before answering, and the habit of checking the results of one's words. Ritual practices and repeatable behavioral patterns strengthen the link between intention and deed, because habit consolidates the correspondence in the automaticity of behavior. Confucius insisted that sincerity is not a pretty word, but a discipline of the heart, trained through everyday actions and a form of speech. Why sincerity of intentions is needed is explained by its role as a basic resource of public life. Trust between people reduces the cost of communication, allows sharing responsibility and building stable institutions. Where word matches deed, constant control and complex coercive mechanisms are not required. Sincerity makes education by example possible. When a leader consistently shows honesty of intentions, others follow because the visible linkage of word and action creates moral attraction. For the individual, sincerity acts as a compass that helps not to lose orientation in difficult circumstances and to make decisions consistent with one's duty and obligations. Where the mechanism breaks down, there are several interrelated failures. First, a gap between word and action, when promises become a tool of manipulation or a mask a person wears for gain. Second, self-deception, when motivation is colored by rationalization and the person ceases to clearly see their true desires. In such a situation, words remain sincere only to the speaker but lose public significance. The third failure arises in social institutions. If external incentives encourage ostensible correctness, sincerity degrades into imitation. Fourth is related to fatigue and role competition. A person may unconsciously split themselves into duties and personal convictions, and then the coincidence of thought, speech, and action falls out of practice. Confucius noted the danger of disharmony and spoke of the importance of constant revision of motives, because public order rests on real, not apparent, agreement. Analysis of causal links shows how failures feed themselves. If a promise is not confirmed by action, others begin to check motives and demand guarantees, which leads to a growth of formalities. Formalities blur internal control and create a situation where only external stimulus works. Inner self-control weakens when society rewards appearance rather than substance. The mechanism of attention is also vulnerable. Without the habit of pausing and hearing one's own motives, a person quickly falls into stereotypical reactions. Consequences: reduced trust, increased transactional interactions, and heightened dependence on rules and punishments. Confucius linked the quality of governance to the state of people's inner world, emphasizing that external order reflects inner honesty. Where sincerity is preserved, a feedback chain operates. Agreement of word and deed generates trust. Trust supports cooperation. Cooperation strengthens shared morality. Where the mechanism breaks, a vicious circle of rituals without substance arises, and these rituals cease to cultivate character. It is important to understand the limits of restoring sincerity. External measures and rules will help return order in the short term, but deep restoration requires inner work and a change of motivation. Social reforms can change incentives, but cannot make the heart be honest if there is no habit of self-observation and readiness to amend. The conclusion is quite practical. Preserving sincerity requires regular work on attention to motives, discipline of speech, and systems of feedback that tie words to consequences. A simple sequence of actions helps strengthen the mechanism. Slowing a response to check motive, clarity of promises regarding the ability to fulfill them, asking those affected to correct you, and readiness to admit mistakes. Leadership with sincerity begins to spread through imitation when others see that words have a price. Confucius spoke of the importance of honesty of heart, and that society is built on the example of those who first linked word and deed. This is not magic, but the technology of character that can be trained. If you keep this mechanism as a habit, you will increase your ability to be reliable and reduce the dispersion of effort on formal display. Practically, it looks like this. Before promising, stop and ask yourself, why am I saying this? What consequences will my word cause for others and for me? You can also ask about timeframes. How realistic is the deadline I am naming? Simple records, a journal of promises and their fulfillment, help create objective feedback. It is also useful to ask your circle to point out discrepancies directly. This is not shameful, but a way to train clarity. It is important to remember kindness toward yourself in the process of change. Habits do not disappear instantly. Each behavioral correction is a step towards strengthening the inner linkage of thought, word, action. Train the ability to admit an error quickly and openly, so as not to accumulate role splitting. Practices of slow response, an honest diary of motivations and agreements, on transparent reporting, create an environment where sincerity becomes a profitable strategy. In the end, sincerity is not a goal, but the competence. It can be measured by the quality of relationships, by how quickly people find common ground, and by how many resources go to control and verification. The clearer the link between what we think, say, and do, the easier life becomes. Confucius reminded, "Build yourself and the world around will change." Start small, and the mechanism of sincerity will become your inner support. Cherish it every day. What makes relationships resilient when they are arranged as pairs of duties between people? And how does this work in everyday life? Let us start with a simple foundation. In a paired structure, each side has a specific zone of responsibility and expected behavior. This sets anchors for actions and removes some uncertainty in interaction. Precision of names and roles here work as protocols. If the term for a role is clear, responsibility is easier to tie to actions. Confucius thought that clearly assigned places and duties create social order because a person knows what is expected of them and knows whom to hold accountable. Next, the mechanism. Paired roles form a network of mutual expectations through repeatable practices and rituals. Rituals fix how exactly a duty is performed and make behavior predictable. Predictability reduces conflictual uncertainty and gives the possibility to build trust. When everyday actions are repeated within defined roles, a person's character is trained in the desired direction, and social life gains stability. Confucius pointed to the importance of ritual as a means of developing habits that, in paired relationships, turn responsibility into habitual action. What methods further support the paired structure? First, fidelity to one's word in a concrete role. A promise given as a representative of a function has weight and is measured by consequences. Second, attention to the names of duties. Verbal precision helps organize control and self-assessment. Third, regular reflection on one's motives. A person must check why they act as they do, so that the role does not become a mask for personal gain. These three directions work together and reinforce each other. Confucius emphasized that the improvement of the person and order proceeds through constant work, so that roles are not empty forms. The causal link manifests at the level of institutions and at the level of personal behavior. When paired duties are clear and supported by practice, the need for external coercion decreases. Control becomes habit, and habit becomes character. If a role is performed sincerely, it sets an example for others and spreads responsibility along the chain. Here the idea of governance by example appears. One who is responsible in their pair influences expectations and behavior in adjacent pairs. Confucius associated the quality of public life with how people perform their duties and roles, because this creates a network of mutual supports. One must take into account the limits of the paired structure. Any role has a tendency toward rigidity if attention to the meaning of duties disappears and only form remains. A role becomes fixed and ceases to develop moral skills if there is no checking of motives and feedback from others. In such conditions, paired relationships turn into automatism that cannot withstand new challenges and conflicts. Therefore, it is important to keep the role flexible as a practice, not as a status. How to maintain flexibility in practice? Regularly aligning expectations with those you are paired with helps keep duties alive. A system of transparent reporting and a habit of admitting mistakes preserve the meaning of the role. Ritual elements are useful not for the sake of form, but for training response and discipline. When duties are performed with attention to motives and consequences, the role becomes a channel of moral development, not merely a function. Confucius saw social life as a space for training character through everyday duties and constant work on oneself. Consequences for personal ethics and public order are obvious. A person who consciously accepts and performs their part in a pair reduces friction in interaction and increases the reliability of relationships. Reliability on a societal scale is composed of many such local agreements. The paired structure turns abstract norms into concrete actions and allows responsibility to be distributed so that solving problems becomes simpler and clearer. This makes life less dependent on coercion and more based on habitual discipline of character. The boundary of applying this idea is clear. Pairs of roles work as a technology of organizing behavior when duties are linked to moral reflection and real responsibility. If roles remain only on paper or are used as a way to evade responsibility, the structure loses meaning. The true strength of paired responsibility manifests in that it requires constant practice and readiness for self-correction. Confucius reminded that public order is built through daily fulfillment of one's duties, and this remains the most constructive way to maintain strong and trusting relationships. In practice, this means discuss duties not once but regularly. When unforeseen circumstances arise, jointly revise the task distribution. Encourage honest communication where admitting mistakes is seen as a step towards strengthening the pair, not as a reason for punishment. And build a feedback institution accessible to both parties. It is also useful to keep in mind the distinction between function and person. The role is performed for the common good, not to affirm one's ego. When duties grow into an opportunity to serve, they cease to be a burden and become a source of meaning. Finally, it is important to teach new participants the culture of responsibility through example and mentorship. Personal example allows faster absorption of the subtleties of role performance, and a mentor helps see hidden expectations and avoid the mechanical approach. Thus, the paired structure remains a living form of organizing human interaction, requiring attention, courage for self-correction, and readiness for constant dialogue. This method does not abolish individuality, but channels it into a direction useful to all. It is precisely the combination of personal responsibility and paired reciprocity that creates the resilience of relationships. Practice is more important than words. Patience is needed. The result of daily practice of self-observation and self-correction manifests in a noticeable ordering of your reactions and decisions. Actions become more deliberate, feelings are controlled more gently, and relationships more reliable. This is not an abstract virtue, it is a direct effect. Fewer sudden outbursts, fewer regrets, more consistency in behavior. When you check your intentions every morning and analyze in the evening what happened, you create an internal standard to which you can return in any difficult situation. Such a standard becomes a social force, because people around begin to orient themselves to your stability and trust your promises. Why this works so consistently? The mechanism is simple and at the same time deeply human. Attention consolidates patterns. Constant reflection includes the mind's mirror function. You see what guided you and correct the next step. This feedback over time restructures habits, and habits form character. In your life project, you move the center of responsibility inside yourself. And it is this movement from external control to internal observation that makes action stable. Confucius paid great attention to practice and repetition as ways of training the soul, because repetition imprints not thoughts, but character. So what does self-observation mean at the everyday level?
And what questions should you ask yourself? First, ask about motives. Why am I doing this? Whom will it affect? Where does the desire to act originate? Then analyze execution. Were the steps clear and honest? Did words match deeds? Finally, evaluate consequences. What changed in relations with people and in your own sense of justice? This three-step cycle, attention to intention, checking action, accounting results, turns abstract care for morality into a concrete technique. Ask questions, not for self-defense, but to clarify the path. Analysis of how to keep this cycle from turning into rigid self-criticism or superficial reporting. Softness in evaluation and the habit of recording not only mistakes, but small successes are important.
Self-observation should have a development perspective, not serve as a list of punishments for oneself. It is useful to introduce boundaries, time for reflection, a limit on the length of the entry, specific criteria for correcting one step. This disciplines reflection and makes it a tool of growth rather than a source of anxiety. The ability to admit a mistake without humiliation is one of the skills that turns self-correction into a genuine moral practice. One more clarification regarding the limits of this practice. Self-observation does not cancel responsibility to others, it strengthens it. A person who honestly monitors their motives more easily accepts external feedback and is more likely to restore trust after mistakes. It is important to distinguish self-observation from complacency. Where the first entails readiness to change behavior, the second preserves the status quo. Transparency before those with whom you have duties supports joint work on errors and makes personal practice part of the common field of responsibility. Practical techniques that help maintain the daily habit of self-observation are simple and accessible. Short notes at the end of the day, a 1-minute pause before an important decision to state the motive aloud, formulating one concrete step for correction for tomorrow, a meeting with a mentor or trusted person that once a week provides external perspective, and returning to rituals that help stop and focus. Such a set works like a trainer. Habit is formed through small repetitions, and each fixation becomes a point of growth. Confucius believed that learning and ritual serve that very discipline of the soul, which turns knowledge into action. An image that helps hold the idea in memory. Daily self-correction is like polishing a stone. One movement does not change the shape, but thousands of careful movements create a smooth surface. The point is that the moral fabric is woven gradually, through millions of small decisions about honesty, attentiveness, and responsibility. You gradually stop acting by inertia and begin to act by choice, and this change is visible to others and is passed on. The tie to Confucian tradition and practice is clear. Constant self-examination, attention to motives, and discipline of habits are the moral forming techniques he recommended as a way to cultivate individuals and society. Confucius saw daily training of character as the basis of order in the family and the state. By maintaining the simple habit of self-observation, you find yourself in the same line of practice that he regarded as the main means of moral improvement. Each day spent in honest reflection and careful correction is a contribution to your character and to the web of trust created by those around you. It is important to remember patience. Changes of character do not happen instantly, and sometimes progress seems imperceptible. Be gentle with yourself at every step. Note victories, but do not miss the lessons that troubles provide. Support from others helps. Tell loved ones about your practice. Ask them to help with reminders or an honest assessment. Do not demand perfection. Sometimes it is enough to reduce harm, show empathy, or keep a promise, even if it requires effort. Watch that rituals do not become meaningless routine. Refresh the wording of intentions. Change the questions. Try new ways of recording. Sometimes it is useful to record not only decisions, but doubts. This way, you will see the dynamics of thoughts and avoid cyclical uncertainty. Of course, there are moments when professional help is needed. If self-observation causes excessive anxiety or getting stuck, consultation with a psychologist or mentor will speed the way. Fill the practice with meaning. Connect small steps to what matters to you: relationships, work, roles in the family. Let self-observation become your compass. With it, it is easier to find a path in the chaos of choices and not lose your humanity. With faith and love. In one county, the headman chooses a treasurer not by pedigree and not by a deed to a house, but by how a person behaves in simple matters. Whether they can repay a debt on time, whether they take responsibility for a promise, how they speak with neighbors, and under what circumstances they forgo profit. At one of the gatherings, he asks a candidate to keep the accounts for a month, then looks at the records, questions witnesses, and pays attention to small things, such as whether the person left a retained sum in the common fund until matters were resolved. This particular case shows the method: practical testing of behavior and collective observation. In general, selection for positions should be regarded as a way to arrange public life through people's character, not through paper and status. Confucius viewed appointment as a moral technology. It is important that the role has a precise name and that expectations flow from that name. When duties are clearly written down, every action gains meaning, and fulfilling roles becomes a matter of responsibility rather than personal whim. Suitability for service is measured by behavior, honesty in small things, respect for the ritual of duties, willingness to learn and to correct oneself. This criterion makes institutions flexible and humane, because people learn to work in a linkage of duties and responses. The selection mechanism can be unfolded through several practices. First, observation in action. Short probationary periods with strictly defined tasks. Second, attention to the rituals of communication and to how a person performs ordinary work, because regular actions reveal the habits of character. Third, discussions with neighbors and colleagues to gather information about the consistency of deeds. Fourth, systematic on-the-job training, where the newcomer goes through models of behavior of elders and through discussion of mistakes. These techniques work together. Testing provides information, ritual forms habit, training reinforces the standard. The reason for such practice is that power without moral grounding quickly loses trust. The system is arranged so that small duties become a proving ground for larger ones. The role serves as a filter and constant observation as a corrector. The consequences are noticeable. If selection is built on real behavior, the tendency to abuse decreases. Predictability and trust between people increase, and the willingness to perform duties regardless of personal gain grows. The limits of this scheme are clear. Selection does not replace laws and institutions. It complements them. The system requires transparency and repeatability of actions. Practical limitations must be stated plainly. Superficial manners are not equivalent to a moral act. Praises and ceremonies will not replace long-term observation. To minimize assessment errors, periodic checks, clear criteria, and the possibility of recall with explanation of reasons are introduced. Rotation of positions and mentorship are important so that the chosen one does not become stuck in the role and continues to learn. Character is measured not in a single trial, but over time, so both long-term observations and instant tests are necessary. On the organizational level, it is useful to record duties and expectations so that correcting names becomes a natural tool. Match each title with a set of actions that serve as proof of suitability. For a post that involves caring for resources, the following are important: accuracy of reporting, willingness to admit an error, ability to make good losses, transparency in communication. For a role related to teaching or judging, key signs are consistency of explanations, respect for the ritual of discussion, and the ability to listen. When duties are concrete, evaluation is fair and understandable. The moral side of selection is manifested in examples of a leader's behavior. A leader who models the performance of rituals and clarity in words significantly reduces the need to use coercion. Confucius insisted that power should rest on moral reputation and that people imitate what they see. This is precisely why selection through observation of daily actions becomes a pedagogy of power. It teaches others what is considered right. You, if you have influence in appointments, can start with simple steps. Make a list of key actions for each role. Introduce monthly trials with a report to the community. Involve in evaluation people whose observation of the candidate is trustworthy. Ask the candidate to tell about their last mistake and how they corrected it. These questions reveal the attitude toward responsibility and readiness to learn. I have seen how an honest admission of a small mistake often increases trust more than obstinate displays of impeccability. The remaining limitations concern systemic incentives. If salary and status strongly support selfish behavior, selection by character will work worse. Therefore, selection should be accompanied by creating an environment where honesty is advantageous. Transparent reports, social recognition for fidelity to duties, mechanisms for recovery after failure. Preparing personnel through training and rituals of habit makes choice more reliable. Confucius emphasized the importance of upbringing and constant practice as means to preserve order and trust. At the end, it is important to adopt limited optimism. Selection by qualities and behavior is a powerful tool when it is embedded in practices that test and develop people. It is a path where job titles gain content through actions, where ritual and training shape character, and where leadership lives by what it requires of subordinates. Confucius taught that society rests on examples and on habits, and it is precisely through careful, constant selection and education that these examples multiply. Focus on the small, act consistently, and the system will begin to reflect the values you want to see around you. Faith that a person can change and improve through learning and habit is not an abstract thesis, but a working rule for everyday life and governance. It says that moral qualities are not granted once and for all, but grow through regular actions, through repetition, and through habit shaped into ritual. Confucius saw teaching as long work on attention and memory, where each exercise strengthens the will and makes action more predictable. One can read this rule as a challenge. How to believe in the long road when there are short-term incentives and instant gains around. How to preserve the meaning of study when results are not evident immediately. These questions show the tension. People tend to judge by what is visible. Much in culture amplifies quick effects, The environment rewards cleverness and cunning more often than diligence and patience. A reward system where bonus matters more than habit impedes the development of one who bets on long practice. This is a real social and psychological barrier, and it cannot be ignored. The reason for this barrier lies in the combination of individual predispositions and external incentives. The process of improvement requires three things: regularity of actions, clear models of behavior, and responsive feedback from the environment. If regularity is broken, the habit does not take root. If the model is absent, direction is lost. If there is no feedback, motivation does not form. The consequences are obvious. Without support, habits do not form. The moral accessibility of ideas remains nominal, and public expectations crumble. The limitations of this process are also clear. Education and ritual work slowly and require stable institutions and personal discipline. Confucius emphasized repetition and mentorship as the core of this arrangement. Another kind of tension arises, connected to the quality of practice. Superficial imitation of rituals creates the illusion of working on oneself rather than the result. When movements are repeated without reflection, habit becomes automatism without moral depth. There is a danger of formal performance, where appearance replaces essence. Confucius pointed to the sincerity of intentions and to the fact that the ritual, deprived of meaning, does not reproduce virtue. This conflict between form and content requires a cautious approach. The rule needs to be translated into concrete actions. Start with simple requirements for practices and their regularity. Choose a few and do them every day at the same time. Introduce clear quality criteria for what counts as completion. Agree on regular feedback with those who observe the process. Finally, create a system of rituals that tie intentions to bodily habits. Repetition, structure, and reflection work better when tied to specific moments of the day. This is the path from abstraction to bodily memory, which Confucius considered a reliable tool of upbringing. To strengthen the effect, use 4 practices that support the rule: regularity, a role model, discussion, and public accountability. Regularity makes behavior automatic. A role model shows what to expect and what to strive for. Discussion helps to rethink mistakes and consolidate understanding. Public accountability creates external pressure that supports internal discipline. All 4 practices reinforce each other and make the process of improvement sustainable. One should remember the limits of the method. Personal aspiration without support from the environment and institution is often poorly maintained. Material incentives and social structures influence the tendency to repeat good actions. Therefore, implementing habits requires work on 3 levels at once: individual, interpersonal, and organizational. Individually, commitment and daily practice. Interpersonally, mentorship and checking by trusted people. At the organizational level, clear rules that assemble repetitive actions into a system. Confucius regarded such combinations as the natural field for cultivating character and order. Follow a simple algorithm for implementing habits. Set a minimal baseline, record the result, ask for feedback, increase difficulty, repeat the cycle. A small action performed consistently is stronger than periodic efforts. I have seen how the sequence of such cycles change the behavior of whole groups. When people see that a habit brings a visible and honest result, their motivation becomes less dependent on external rewards. The conclusion is built on the fact that faith in improvement through learning and habit is justified when it is supported by concrete practices and institutions. Confucius was considered a proponent of constant self-work and believed that character grows through ritual and teaching. You can start small and keep the course thanks to regularity and feedback. In the long run, such efforts change not only the individual, but the communities around them. Confucius left us the understanding that cultivating character is a technology that can and should be applied systematically. It is important to have tolerance for uneven progress. Sometimes steps backwards do not mean failure, but serve as an important signal for rethinking. Strengthening habits keep flexibility. Adapt the practice to new circumstances, but do not change its meaning. Seek support from those who value the process, not only the result. Genuine change takes time and friendly oversight, honest feedback, and the ability to admit mistakes. In this sense, ritual is not a prison, but a frame that helps body and mind coordinate intention with action. The clearer the goal and the more frequent the repetition, the firmer the character will become, and the easier it will be to pass the experience on to others, turning individual improvement into a public good. It is important to remember, small victories add up to the larger image of personality. Note progress, but do not let it become a cause for complacency. Use success as a platform for new commitments and a higher standard. Then the ritual will remain alive. Be patient and always respect your steps. Habit is the body that remembers intention. Form is the language that gives that body direction. One side concerns repetition of movements and small decisions. The other, the order of words, roles, and rules that make those movements understandable and accountable. The contrast is immediately visible. Habit secures the will at the level of actions. Form organizes meaning and public accountability. Habit works as a saving of attention. Each time you turn a desire into a repeating act, the load on will decreases. Thought stops spending energy on every decision, and energy is freed for more complex tasks. This is not a mystical effect, but a simple mechanics. Repetition stimulates neural pathways. Behavior becomes less random. Form at the same time acts as an interface between the individual and society. Role names, rules of conduct, and rights give habit context and quality criteria. Where there is form, habit gains measurability and public confirmation, and therefore stability. How does this manifest in strength of will? Will often weakens at the moment of choice. It has a fluctuating resource. Habits remove the burden from the moment of choice, and forms fix that the choice mattered. The mechanism is simple. Repetition makes the action easy to perform, and formalization makes it obligatory for oneself and visible to others. The consequences for character are obvious. Regular actions, embedded in a comprehensible structure, form a chain of small victories. These victories increase self-respect and create an expectation of one's own reliability. It is this expectation that grows into a willpower that does not constantly need to be fueled by the force of intention. The reason for this connection is the natural economy of the psyche. The process design includes three key elements: frequency of performing the action, clarity of what counts as correct execution, and feedback from the environment. Frequency strengthens physical and mental schemes. Clarity removes wavering and doubt. Feedback supports motivation and corrects errors. The consequences appear on three levels: personal, interpersonal, and societal. On the personal level, habits turn will into a reliable tool. Interpersonally, habits create predictability and trust. In the social dimension, they aggregate into a culture where behavior becomes the norm and an expected standard. Formalization must go hand in hand with meaning. Confucius constantly emphasized that ritual without inner support loses its power as an educational tool. It is precisely the combination of form and sincere striving that produces the effect of strengthening character. Form is not an end in itself. It becomes effective only when a person internalizes it as a way to relate action to duty and to other people. Then, habit ceases to be mere automatism and becomes a sign of reliability and the moral line of behavior. The limitations of this approach require attention. Habit can ossify. Form can become devalued if meaning and attention disappear. Cultivating will through repetition needs periodic reflection. From time to time, it is useful to pause the flow of repetitions and ask yourself about the quality of intention and the conformity of the form to current circumstances. Reflection does not destroy discipline. It keeps it alive and adequate. Here, Confucius again imposes order between the bodily and the spiritual. Ritual strengthens will, and sincerity and reflection preserve its direction. The practical side consists of small but sustainable techniques. Choose one action. Do it in the same way and at the same time. Give it a name and criteria of execution. Record the result and ask another person to observe compliance. Increase difficulty gradually when the basic habit is already embedded. These steps are not complicated, but they change character through repetition and social responsibility. Confucius noted that upbringing requires both personal discipline and external structure. Both components work as a system where habit is the engine and form is the rudder. To blend into the general moral rhythm, one can do so through responsibility to the community. When actions are visible and tied to roles, they gain a social dimension. Breaking a habit ceases to be only a private weakness and becomes a matter of trust. This makes will discipline not only for its own sake, but also for others. Repeated, formalized behavior becomes a signal of reliability and stability. A leader who himself fulfills small obligations transmits the expectation of honesty and order without threats or control. Fixing meaning is needed at the end of each cycle. Habit stabilizes will through bodily repetition. Form places this habit in a social and meaningful context, makes it measurable and accountable. Confucius shows that character grows not from rare feats, but from constancy and order. If you build around your intentions a simple system of repeating actions with clear rules and attention to their meaning, will transforms into discipline, and discipline becomes the basis of a reliable character. Keep this as a practical principle and use it every day. Confucius taught that it is precisely regularity and form that create a person who can be trusted. Upbringing and ritual turn out to be a more resilient method of maintaining order than a system of punishments. This statement is not about moral preference, but about technical effectiveness. Ritual shapes habits that reduce the need for coercion, and teaching turns external rules into internal guides. The mechanism of action is simple but requires time and attention. Repeated ceremonial actions create bodily and mental schemes that become available automatically at the needed moment. When rules are felt through bodily rhythm and through joint performance, they cease to be an abstraction and become part of everyday behavior. A clear ritual structure sets criteria of correctness and makes a violation noticeable not only to authority but also to the community. The aesthetics of the action itself, the order, the spoken words, the sequence of movements, or the music, works as a soft instrument that both trains the emotions and cements meaning. In one example, a local community introduced a short communal meeting ritual before the start of work. 3 minutes of collective silence and a brief announcement of the day's tasks. Participants noted that after several weeks, there were fewer conflicts, people got to work more quickly, and a sense of shared responsibility emerged. Punishment rests on coercion and fear. It provides an immediate reaction to a transgression, but does not produce internal agreement with the norm. Education through form and ritual works through identification. A person internalizes the rule as something expected by themselves and by others. Internal acceptance reduces the need for external control. Over time, social practices repeated within a stable structure create predictability of behavior, which is more important for the resilience of society than the short-term results of intimidation. The reason this works lies in the organization of the human psyche and in the structuring of social ties. Frequent repetition reinforces neural pathways and bodily skills. A clear form reduces uncertainty and lowers the likelihood of conflicts arising from role confusion. Feedback from the environment, manifesting as praise, attention, and public recognition, strengthens the motivation to act in concert. The consequences at the group level are obvious: less hidden hostility, higher trust, more resilient cooperation. The limit of effectiveness is visible where the ritual loses meaning, when actions become an empty display, or when society experiences a sharp crisis requiring immediate measures. Then, education remains a strategic resource, but needs supplements that protect against abuse and ensure safety. The emotional side of ritual plays a key role. Music, the order of movements, and the language of the rite affect not through arguments, but through a sense of belonging and harmony. It is through feelings that the habit of feeling respect for a role and for other people is formed. When the ritual is imbued with meaning, it makes undesirable behavior painful, not because it threatens punishment, but because it violates an already accepted internal standard. This is a subtle but powerful shift of mode. From external coercion, an internal rule arises, nourished by social confirmation. Ritual and upbringing depend on the example of those who hold power. A leader who himself observes ritual norms and is visibly connected to them reinforces their importance. A model from above makes the practice possible to imitate and mobilizes respect not through threats, but through trust. Consistency matters. If a leader once violates the form, it weakens the very mechanism of education. Therefore, the order established through ritual practice requires responsibility from those who set it. There is a micro technique that makes the system functional on a daily basis. Teach people short, repeatable practices. Discuss the meaning of each element and provide feedback. Gradual increases in the complexity of actions and public recognition of achievements turn individual efforts into collective standards. This replaces the heat of retribution with calm but persistent work on character and relationships. The connection with Confucius's teaching is clear and practical. Confucius saw ritual as a means of cultivating feelings and moral coordination among people in society. He emphasized that order arises not from harsh discipline, but from habit and from the way speech, movement, and music shape the inner harmony. Confucius proposed governing by example and by constant repetition of proper behavior, making instruction a way of building trust. It is clear that the effect of education and ritual is not instantaneous and requires work on the authenticity of practices. But history shows, and practice confirms, that such a strategy yields stable order and makes society less dependent on the force of punishments. Confucius left a tool that can be applied today. Form repeatable, meaningful practices. Keep them alive through personal example and through public confirmation. And then, order becomes the result of upbringing rather than merely the mechanics of law and sanctions. It is also important to remember the risks. Ritual can become an instrument of conformity and exclusion if its content is not revisited and if it transfers power without responsibility. Therefore, ritual practices should combine the stability of form with openness of meaning, explaining reasons, regular reflection, and the possibility of adjustments. It is important to include those affected by the ritual so that it remains meaningful rather than formal. In conditions of modern mobility and cultural diversity, it is useful to adapt rites to people's real needs, shorten their duration, strengthen symbolism, and emphasize shared goals and mutual support. Technologies can help. Reminders, collective success trackers, or recordings of meaningful moments, but they will not replace a living example and genuine attention. Ultimately, ritual is an instrument of human communication. When used consciously, it strengthens trust, facilitates coordination, and makes order not a dogma, but a habit of goodness and responsibility. Such is the chance to create the common good. The problem is that the morality of a collective often ends up dependent on the accidental behavior of individual leaders. When people at the top become alienated from accepted norms or are visible only in managerial decisions, the very notion of responsibility becomes blurred. The consequences are visible. A leader's words are taken as declarations rather than as a model to be repeated. Formal rules do not turn into habits, and public trust becomes fragile. Such a state creates institutional vulnerability. Principles operate episodically and depend on control, instead of living through regular practice and mutual expectations. The criterion of a leader's responsibility should be measurable and substantive. A leader is responsible when his actions and rituals regularly demonstrate the principles for which he is accountable. Concrete signs matter. Visible consistency in words and deeds creates predictability. Commitment to established practices, including public rites or daily rituals of interaction, strengthens social habit. Openness to scrutiny and willingness to accept corrections show that the leader shares common rules rather than using them as a screen. Finally, the ability to name roles precisely and to affirm duties provides a structure that makes responsibility a matter of public attention. If these signs are observed regularly, the moral influence of the leader becomes a working instrument rather than theater. The consequences of following such criteria are deep and multi-layered. At the emotional level, a leader's example cultivates respect and sympathy. People adopt the tone and style of behavior before they absorb verbal arguments. At the level of practice, regular observance of rituals creates a repeating pattern of actions that over time ceases to require constant oversight. At the institutional level, a leader's transparency and accountability allow norms to serve as a means of coordination, rather than merely as instruments of pressure. As a result, the need for external coercion decreases, willingness for mutual responsibility rises, and space for initiative appears, because people know which expectations are shared in the community. The effect spreads along the chain. Example at the top sets the rhythm. Rhythm forms habits. Habits strengthen trust. Trust increases the community's ability to solve complex tasks together. The internal dynamics of this process rely on habits of attention and on societal mechanisms of imitation. People watch the meanings of actions, not only the words, and therefore a leader's consistency serves as the key to interpreting shared rules. Ritual behavior, when it is sincere and comprehensible, performs an educative function. It trains attention, emotional responsiveness, and long-term behavioral skills. This explains why philosophers of the past paid attention to the model of governance, and why the name Confucius is often associated with the idea that power should be linked to moral practice. Confucius emphasized that an elevated position imposes a demand on one's way of life, because the public image of the leader becomes a curriculum for an entire community. The limit of the effectiveness of a leader's example is clear and requires frank acknowledgement. In conditions of severe institutional deficit, in the absence of verification mechanisms, and amid broad social polarization, a single example is insufficient for sustainable change. When norms are blurred and roles are poorly defined, even a conscientious leader faces the fact that his practices remain local and do not integrate into daily life. In crisis situations that require urgent intervention and tough managerial decisions, a leader's regular educational work serves as a base but requires supplements in the form of organizational measures and security steps. Top-down responsibility works only in combination with feedback mechanisms and the community's capacity to hold power accountable. This limit also implies another important idea about the nature of responsibility. A leader is responsible not only when he acts correctly, but also when he creates conditions for his actions to be understandable and reproducible. That means rituals and public practices must have an explainable logic, accessible to everyone, and space for discussion. It is precisely this combination of a visible model and educational work that turns personal behavior into a collective habit. Confucius wagered that order is born of consistent practice and clear names for roles, and therefore leadership responsibility includes the ability to name, explain, and accept corrections. A practical recommendation follows directly from the criterion and the limit. Choosing or forming leaders should be based on their ability to lead by example, ensure transparency, and be receptive to public feedback. Supporting such leaders includes creating institutions of oversight, regular practices of joint enactment of norms, and mechanisms for recognizing progress. When you look at a group or organization, pay attention not only to formal powers, but to the rhythms and habits that management sets. Where example is systematic and accompanied by structures of verification, the collective's morality becomes a stable force that coordinates behavior more easily and effectively than isolated commands. This approach reflects a long-term appeal to human nature and social technique. Confucius insisted that power should be educative and that a leader's responsibility is manifest in the constancy of practices. Adopting this idea today means building governance as work on shaping the character of society, where example from above does not replace institutions, but makes them functional and trusted. The point is that leadership responsibility for Confucius is not a role put on for spectacle, but a constant engineering of social life. A leader shapes rhythms, designs practices, and sets the language by which people understand their duties. When power becomes a set of orders, people learn to obey on command. When power lives in practice, people learn to act out of habit and meaning. I often think about how subtle this mission is. To govern morals is to arrange the space so that virtue becomes a convenient and intelligible path for every day. Speaking of the mechanics, it is important to note several layers of work. The first layer is the establishment of forms, names, roles, rituals, procedures. Precise names clothe duties in clarity. Regular rites teach attention to detail and reinforce expectations. The second layer is the internal content of forms. Why this particular ritual, which emotion or skill it cultivates, how music and the order of words foster a sense of measure. The third layer is feedback. A leader's readiness to explain, accept adjustments, and allow scrutiny makes practices alive. Without all three layers, any external strictness turns into an empty form deprived of educative potential. The limits of this approach are also obvious and require clarity. If institutions are weak, rituals remain a private habit and their influence does not spread. If rites turn into farce, they reproduce display discipline without internal orientation. If under the cover of reverence there is suppression of voice and evasion of responsibility, public trust is destroyed. Any system where filial piety or respect for elders is used to exclude criticism loses the capacity for self-correction. Confucian technique succeeds where practices are explainable, where roles are open to renewal, and where existing mechanisms allow the community to hold power accountable. Distortions appear in several typical forms. Ritual can become a meaningless routine when people follow the procedure only for outward order. The aesthetics of ceremony can serve as a mask for authoritarian rule if the leader demands submission instead of sharing responsibility. The philosophical bet on habit and education can be used to justify the preservation of privileges when habits entrench unjust distributions of roles. It is important to be able to recognize such distortions because the technology of character formation must be transparent in its goals and methods, not serve blind tradition or a dominating force. Practical measures reduce the risk of distortions. Clarity in names and roles is needed so that duties do not blur and responsibility is legible. Educational work explaining the meanings of rituals and the music of rites is needed so that external order becomes an internal skill. Mechanisms of verification and a channel for criticism are needed that preserve respect while allowing errors to be corrected. Selection of people for positions should be based on their ability to be exemplars and on their readiness for public accountability. These measures turn the moral image of the leader into an instrument that expands the community's freedom of action through trust rather than narrowing it through fear. Assembled, this philosophy creates a coherent picture. Humanity becomes a working duty that you cultivate through regular practice. Ritual acts as a technology of habit, and habit ranges from simple polite forms to musical events that train sensitivity. The image of the noble person is not a status, but a constant inner work that can be checked by the consistency of words and deeds. Filial piety fits into a family infrastructure of expectations, where respect combines with responsibility. Precision in names and roles functions as the architecture of society, restoring the causal link between duty and consequence. Righteousness, reciprocity, learning, and sincerity of intent form a toolkit for governing by example rather than by repression. All these elements are interconnected. Ritual trains attention. Attention makes speech reliable. Reliability gives the example the power to influence. Influence forms habits. habits create institutions. Applying this picture has practical significance. When you find yourself in the role of organizer or participant in a community, pay attention to which practices are regularly repeated, what meanings are ascribed to them, and what the feedback system is. Watch how role expectations are formed and how transparent they are to everyone. Evaluate leaders by their ability to explain and accept corrections, by the consistency of their behavior, and by how their actions are reproduced in people's everyday lives. Try to support rituals that cultivate attention and the capacity for reciprocity, avoiding those that entrench irresponsibility. The conclusion implied is that Confucius's philosophy is a set of practical tools for shaping character and social coordination. It teaches how, through repetition, clarity of roles, and the model of example, moral habits can be grown that make governance predictable and worthy of trust. The limits and distortions of this technique require constant vigilance. Rituals must be alive, reverence must be paired with responsibility, and power must be transparent and accountable. If you keep these ideas in mind, you will see how individual practices come together into a system where instruction, habit, and example merge into one durable practice of communal life.